ask you very specifically, when you are selecting and managing funds, and this I guess is a question as much for John, how much stationarity do you observe in the way that managers behave in funds, and how does this affect your behaviour?
This is a very important question because, I mean, at the end of the day, this is the core of the matter. If you are able to find an alpha that is stable, you're done. If not, it's very difficult. I would say that there is some kind of persistence, I would say, in the alpha if you are checking for the right betas, basically. If you have we have factor model to analyze performance, and we check for the residual alpha in the last 6 months. But I would say this is just 10 to 20% of a decision to select a fund. I'm not a big believer of purely quantitative analysis on funds. But I think that at least in the short term, there is some persistence of alpha if you are able to choose the right factors, basically.
Look at this. I'll bring Amin in a second. If we look at this mix, this synthesis between different strategies, I'd like to bring Ben in because we've heard the multifamily office, we've heard the fund of funds, we've heard the manager of managers, and the private banks view is obviously a very important one, because if we look back to the 1970s and Professor Bar Rosenberg, he was the darling of the sun-kissed Californian quant shops with his tie-dyed T-shirts, his tantric chanting before dinner. But at the same time, he had a very systematic view of the world, and he was looking for some kind of merger between art and science, and this acceptance of quantitative investing as a central part of it. Do you feel that the same kind of movement is perhaps taking root 40 years later? We're seeing some of the mid-sized Swiss private banks again stressing the speed of the wind, the worldly trends, and trying to mingle them with the quantitative strategies. And I'm curious, when you sit down with Rupert and you're looking at the portfolio construction techniques, you might use structured products and other devices alongside your preferred traditional actively managed funds. Might you also use funds with a quantitative bias or methodology within that mix?
I mean, there's no real hard and fast rules in terms of, it really is deciding what mix of exposures we want and which products we think provide the most reliable access to those factors, and actually being quite flexible in terms of assessing those, as we go through time and manage portfolios. But I do think there's quite a structural difference between, I think time frame is critical. There's a couple of significant issues I think for us. One is the time frame on which the underlying strategy is managed, and part of that is relevant to the delivery of a client service and a proactive, well-considered investment strategy that you can present and explain to a client, because that's fundamentally important to any client servicing business, but clearly it's very important for private clients. And with very short-term, high turnover portfolios that are quantitatively driven, it makes that delivery of the message very difficult. And it makes it similarly difficult as an investment selector to attribute performance, to know exactly what's been driving performance. And often not often, but instances where it's been difficult, it's been a pretty shallow sort of validation of that return stream by simply saying, well, the whole market moved that way, it moved against us, and that's not really good enough from a fund selector.
Is there a perception problem, Amin? You mentioned about the old quant versus the new quant, and quant strategies in many ways, they seem to have fallen out of favour with many, if not most of the pension funds and investment consultants that we speak to in the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark and Sweden. The investors we've spoken to fundamentally doubted where they're getting anything special for their money at all. And in short, quant strategies have been shelved by many institutions. They feel there's not enough to distinguish the various systematic strategies, as the metrics they're using are far too similar. Some investors say there's no way we would use quant methodology anymore for asset allocation, though we might consider it for limited stock picking assignments. Does this coincide with the research that you're doing?
Yes, it does. But I think it also depends upon what you mean by quant strategies. I like to draw a distinction here between the old style approach, which was purist, and the new style approach, which is pragmatic. In the old style approach, the tendency amongst the purists was very much rely on what the models were telling you when it came to making investment decisions. You know, they very rarely deviated, and I've worked with a number of investment houses as an advisor where that was the case, that in very few circumstances they would overwrite what the model was telling them, because these models were very sophisticated, and also they were trying to analyze almost everything under the sun. Any data sets that they had, they would quant the hell out of them. That was a phrase that they used to use. Now that approach no longer works, and very few people are using it. The pragmatic approach is something that I think we've been sort of talking around the table, where you sort of say, you know, we need these quant models, because no matter, even if you're a sort of a top-down investor, you need some kind of investment beliefs, but you need that verified on the ground. So quant models are used very much as a kind of, as I referred earlier on, as a first stage or a second stage rocket, where, you know, you have some investment beliefs and then you really look at the data and try and form a view. I think the deductive approach that Matthew was talking about, I see a lot of the deductive approach. So you're really sort of marrying your economic ideas and your economic beliefs with what the data is sort of telling you. But that purist, sort of this pragmatic approach realizes very clearly that although the past is the best guide to the future, in the current environment, it is a very imperfect guide. And therefore, what you really need to do is to use your judgment. And I think this is where we begin to sort of see large institutional investors doing something which is very interesting. And that was, by way of question I had for you folks. The first thing they're saying is that anywhere between 50 to 80% of returns on the portfolio come from sensible asset allocation decisions. So the issue for them is, who does the asset allocation? Do they do it before they choose the managers? Or do they really choose the managers and say, you know, we like these people? And like you were saying, John, you know, you go and kick the tires and then choose these people, and then you begin to look at their performance. More and more institutional investors want to do asset allocation themselves, or they want it done away from their managers. And they take a view that somewhere between 50 to 80% really of returns come from those decisions. The second problem that they have is that whatever macroeconomic variable assumptions they're making in asset allocation decisions, they often find that those assumptions sometimes vary as soon as the assets are given out to quant managers who have different assumptions about, you know, how the economies are going to perform. Like, for example, what I was saying earlier on, you know, when would quantitative easing strategy be changed? And, you know, will it strike a balance between inflation and deflation? Now, there are huge differences at the moment about which way it's likely to go and when it's really likely to go. And when there are those kind of tensions, you sort of find that institutional investors prefer to make their own judgment rather than rely on managers to make that judgment for them. So you as managers, for example, in your case, you know, you would actually give a judgment down to your managers and say, this is what our beliefs are, and can you deliver within those beliefs? And that causes a huge amount of tension. And that's why I think these quant strategies are becoming much more pragmatic. I find it difficult to believe that, you know, quant strategies are radically different from high conviction investing in today's climate.
Can we talk a little about the separation of the asset allocation and the manager selection? Because it strikes me that if you have a separated process, there is a risk that you have to find managers who will behave in a manner that is very similar to the assumption sets that drove your asset allocation. Otherwise, you violate those assumption sets and therefore the end asset allocation. I think we have a risk of going back to Matteo's world, where managers have to behave broadly in line with indices. Otherwise, they have undone the work of the asset allocation challenge. How do you respond to that problem? I mean,
well, I think you would sort of try and, you know, come to some kind of a pragmatic conclusion. But recent interviews that we had with very large pension plans, they are basically sort of saying, we made those decisions as a part of our policy portfolio. And now you, the manager that we've chosen, we would really like you to help us implement that through portfolio construction and stock selection. but you stay within those policy parameters of macroeconomic variables. And I think if you don't do that, then you really have difficulty about A, will you really be able to capture high returns through sensible asset allocation? And B, when things don't work out well, was it because we got the wrong managers, or was it because we started out with the wrong policy portfolio? So I see a lot of activities moving up front with institutional investors, and that's why we're sort of seeing the role of consultants becoming very important. We're also seeing big asset managers themselves providing what they call asset allocation products and asset allocation advice. I think that is becoming a very important activity, and everything else to me it becomes second order. Not unimportant, but second order.